Hello everyone, my name is Nestor Darmasguerra, and today for this first edition of the Anglistics Congress, I'm going to present my research in interpersonal voices in queer poetry. So, let's start. Beginning with the background and aim, we must say that queer voices have long been present in Anglophone poetry, yet they remain underexplored from a linguistic perspective. Literary criticism has richly engaged with themes of identity, resistance, and desire, but the fine grained linguistic textures of queer poetry, meaning how language itself constructs relationships, challenges norms, and creates intimacy, have received comparatively little attention. Hence, this research project addresses that gap by examining the interpersonal dimension of queer poetic voices. Specifically, it asks, how do queer poets use language to position themselves in relation to readers, lovers, and the queer community? And what linguistic strategies allow them to resist, reshape, or reimagine normative communicative roles? The central aim is to explore the interpersonal metafunction in queer poetry across time, combining linguistic analysis with literary sensitivity. This study is situated within the framework of systemic functional linguistics, or SFL, which conceptualizes language both as a resource for meaning making and as a social semiotic practice. Within this perspective, the interpersonal metafunction provides a powerful analytical lens. The interpersonal metafunction highlights how writers and speakers negotiate roles, establish authority or intimacy, and align or distance themselves from interlocutors. It captures how language encodes effect, judgment, and modality, expressions of possibility, necessity, or certainty. Such categories are invaluable for analyzing queer poetic voices. Queer poets often subvert normative identities, disrupt expected communicative roles, and experiment with unconventional ways of addressing others. By applying SFL to queer poetry, the study foregrounds the social and political dimensions of linguistic choices, showing how poets transform everyday resources of language into tools of resistance, recognition, and belonging. To make this framework concrete, the analysis focuses on a set of linguistic features that are central to interpersonal meaning. Pronoun choice is a powerful resource. I, you, we, and they allow poets to construct shifting subjectivities and invite readers into different relational positions. Mood types such as declaratives, interrogatives, and imperatives signal whether the poet is stating, questioning, or demanding, thus shaping the dynamics of intimacy, challenge, or invitation. Modality expresses what is possible, necessary, or certain, enabling poets to articulate desire, doubt, resistance, and affirmation. Taken together, these features show how queer poets negotiate the delicate balance of intimacy, vulnerability, power, and solidarity. They illuminate the ways in which poetic voices reach out to readers and communities, often challenging dominant norms and imagining alternative modes of relationship. The material for this study is drawn from the Queer Love Poems collection curated by the Poetry Foundation. This carefully selected anthology forms the basis of the corpus, which contains 65 poems and a total of 15,087 tokens. Importantly, the corpus is divided into four thematic subcorpora, each corresponding to a distinct facet of queer love and desire. My Beloved includes 15 poems, Wedding Poems comprises 13 texts, Passionate and Erotic, which is the largest subcorpus, contains 23 poems, and Heartbreak and Longing contains 14 texts. This subdivision not only ensures balanced coverage of different poetic themes, but also allows for meaningful comparisons. It enables the identification of both shared and contrasting linguistic strategies. For instance, how expressions of intimacy in My Beloved differ from the language of ritual in wedding poems, or how desire and vulnerability are articulated differently in the passionate and erotic versus heartbreak and longing sections. In this way, the corpus provides both breadth and depth for linguistic investigation. The methodological approach combines corpus based techniques with close reading. Using the Lanxbox software, the study generates frequency data, keyword lists, collocational patterns, and concordances for interpersonal features. These quantitative results highlight recurring tendencies and patterns across the corpus and its subcorpora. However, poetry cannot be fully understood, of course, through numbers alone. For this reason, the findings are triangulated with close readings of selected passages. This ensures that the nuances of poetic voice, metaphor, rhythm, or irony, for example, are not lost in statistical summaries. The combination of methods allows corpus linguistics to enrich rather than replace literary interpretation. It demonstrates how quantitative analysis can provide a broader map, while close reading allows for detailed exploration of individual poetic landscapes. Beginning with the results section, the first step was to create frequency lists. And across the whole corpus, the most salient words were pronouns, specifically I, you, my, me, your, and we, along with the word love. Together, they make up almost 9% of all tokens. This shows that queer poets build intimacy less by directly naming love and more through pronominal address and positioning. Looking at the subcorpora, some important differences appear. In My Beloved, the pattern mirrors the whole corpus, with I and you dominating and love pushed far down the list, which suggests that intimacy is created through direct address. In wedding poems, your and my move up, showing reciprocity and possession consistent with ritual vows. In passionate and erotic, pronouns are most varied, with I, you, my, we, and me all strongly present, pointing to shifting roles and mutual desire. Finally, in Heartbreak and Longing, my rises in rank, highlighting self focus and possession, while love remains marginal, aligning with themes of absence and loss. Taken together, these results suggest that queer poets use pronouns as their main resource for enacting intimacy and belonging, but they do so in different ways depending on the theme, through dyadic change, ritual reciprocity, fluid subjectivity, or self centered grief. This shows a resistance to conventional sentimental expressions and instead highlights intimacy through subtle patterns of interpersonal grammar. The next step was to analyze the collocations for I and you per subcorpora. The collocate networks show not only how often I and you appear, but also the context in which they are used. In My Beloved, to the left, you is linked with terms of persistence and departure, while I connects to temporal markers suggesting intimacy framed through address and memory. In wedding poems to the right, I and you are paired with speech acts like say and with possessives my and your, reflecting ritual reciprocity consistent with vows. To the left, in passionate and erotic, poems present the densest field, where pronouns co occur with verbs of action and bodily references, foregrounding desire as enacted and embodied. To the left, in heartbreak and longing, I clusters with conditionals and modals such as if and would, while you is linked to functional and possessive terms emphasizing absence and speculation. Overall, queer poets use I and you in distinct ways depending on theme: dialogic intimacy, ritualized reciprocity, embodied action, or speculative absence. This highlights that queerness is encoded not only in themes, but in the relational textures of grammar and collocation. Continuing, across the four corpora, we see that nouns, verbs, pronouns, and adpositions dominate, giving queer poetry a shared grammatical backbone, but each theme emphasizes categories differently. In My Beloved, the frequency of pronouns is striking, pointing to intimacy and direct address to the be beloved. In contrast, wedding poems are noun heavy, reflecting the ceremonial and communal language of ritual. The passionate and erotic poems use the widest range of categories, including adjectives and adverbs, highlighting the sensory and expressive intensity of desire. Finally, heartbreak and longing poems distribute categories more evenly, relying on auxiliaries and conjunctions to capture reflection, temporality, and relational complexity. Looking at stance markers, we find important thematic differences. My Beloved poems balance hedges and boosters, mixing intimacy with moments of hesitation. Wedding poems overwhelmingly favor boosters over 90%, underscoring the certainty and affirmation typical of marriage rituals. The passionate and erotic poems show the opposite tendency, with more hedges than boosters, suggesting desire is expressed as both intense and uncertain. Finally, Heartbreak and Longing leans towards boosters but still features many hedges, reflecting how grief is conveyed with strong conviction yet also with hesitation and doubt. The expanded concordance reveals a strong prevalence of hedging models over boosters, with 63.2% of identified stance markers functioning as hedges. The most frequent hedge is, with 23 tokens, could, followed by can, its epistemic sense, 15, may, 10, might 6, and should when used tentatively another 6. In contrast, boosters are less common, 36.8%, most often expressed through will, 19 tokens, must, 11, and shall, 5. This distribution highlights how queer poets often position themselves within possibility, uncertainty, or conditionality rather than asserting inevitably. Such reliance on hedges aligns with the themes of fluidity, risk, and precarious intimacy running through much queer poetry. Nonetheless, the presence of boosters, particularly must and will, shows moments where poets shift toward necessity, urgency, or ritual assertion, underscoring the tension between vulnerability and determination in queer expression. Finally, for the discussions and conclusions, across the corpus, queer poetry shares a backbone of nouns, verbs, pronouns, and adpositions, but each theme highlights these categories differently. My Beloved foregrounds pronouns to build intimacy through memory and dialogue. Wedding poems privilege nouns reflecting the ceremonial and reciprocal language of ritual. Passionate and erotic shows the widest lexical range with modifiers and verbs situating pronouns in action and embodiment, enacting desire itself, and Heartbreak and Longing balances categories but leans on auxiliaries and conjunctions, which construct conditional and speculative frames of absence and grief. Collocational networks of I and you reinforce these differences: dialogic memory in Beloved, vow like exchanges in Wedding, embodied action in Erotic, and speculative absence in Heartbreak. Stance markers add another layer. Hedges dominate across themes, highlighting possibility and conditionality, while boosters surface most strongly in wedding poems as ritual affirmation. Taken together, queer poets rarely name love directly. Instead, they construct intimacy and belonging through subtle shifts in grammar and stance. Finally, this matters because queer poetry represents voices that have historically been silenced or overlooked. These poems challenge heteronormative norms of intimacy and identity, and this study shows that queerness is not just in the themes but in the grammar itself. Pronouns, stance markers, and modality become tools to encode belonging, vulnerability, and resistance. Systemic functional linguistics provides the right framework for this work because it views language as meaning making in context. Its focus on the interpersonal metafunction allows us to see how poets negotiate roles, emotions, and relationships, insights that are invisible if we only look at themes or word counts. The broader conclusion is that queerness is constructed not only what poets say, but in how they linguistically structure intimacy, desire, ritual, and loss in this case. This deepens our understanding of queer voices and highlights the politics of language at the heart of poetry. Finally, due to the nature of this presentation, it has been extremely summarized. So if you have any questions, you can write them below. And thank you very much.